John Jay College and the Graduate Center della City University di New York. Il suo libro più recente, Italian Prison in the Age of Positivism, è appena stato tradotto in Italia. Anche i libri precedenti, Prostitution and the State in Italy e Born to Crime, Cesare Lombroso and the Origins of Biological Criminology, sono stati tradotti rispettivamente nel 1995 e nel 2004. Inoltre, insieme a Nicolan Rafter, ha curato l'edizione di 2 libri di Lombroso, Criminal Man del 2006 e Criminal Woman nel 2004, libro che poi è apparso anche in traduzione italiana nel 2009. Inoltre, con vari saggi, Gibson è intervenuta su altri aspetti vicino a questi temi, dai pregiudizi degli scienziati positivisti sugli abitanti del Sud alla nascita del manicomio criminale in Italia. Una frequentazione assidua e prolungata nel tempo della storia della penisola, tra 8 e 900. Da cosa è nato questo suo interesse per l'Italia?
Grazie per l'intervista, and excuse me if I speak in English. It's very interesting to think about some of these questions about my past research and I guess too long career as a historian. I first came to Italy in 1974 and 75 to do my dissertation research. So it's been, I hate to say, almost 50 years of conducting research in Italy. It's hard to say why I was interested in European history, but I certainly wanted to study another culture, another society. I felt that I wasn't that particularly interested in my roots, as many American historians are, or in American history, which seemed to me to a bit boring, that I knew it too well. I initially went to graduate school in intellectual history, French intellectual history, because I'd studied French for many, many years. I was attracted to the rich culture, literary, artistic traditions, and I particularly found the various social thinkers of the 19th and early 20th century to be something that I hope to study. But during graduate school, the new field of social history, in the sense of history from the bottom up, was developing, and I became more and more interested in trying to look at poor or marginal groups to figure out how everyday life was lived, rather than simply looking at social theories. So within that context, I also, as someone who was a kind of young women's historian, tried to find a group of poor women. I wasn't particularly interested at that point in elite or bourgeois women, of poor women to study. And prostitution was a kind of newly emerging topic in American and British history. I thought this might be an especially good group to study because I went to graduate school at Indiana University, where the Kinsey Sex Institute is located. As it turned out, there wasn't much help there. No one particularly, they were mostly sociologists, understood what I was doing. And at least they had a library where I could read a trove of old, pretty awful, boring books on prostitution, but I read the classics in English. But it did turn out to be a fascinating topic because I had an intersection of women's history, history of sexuality, of poverty, and what I expected less legal and what was coming to be called criminal justice history. In a kind of crazy move, I switched from French to Italian history when I found out that another young scholar, was studying France. This was very naive that I somehow thought the topic would have been done. And since I had studied Italian, I switched countries. And my advisor, William Cohen, was from a family, a German Jewish family who had fled the Nazis, ended up in Sweden for a while, and his father worked in Ethiopia. So my advisor also knew Italian and was comfortable with something which he probably should have told me not to do after studying French history for so many years. And it was a little difficult when I got to Italy. I'd never been there. I had no contacts. He had no contacts. I had to look up the address of the Archivio Centrale in the phone book and really work on my own. There was, of course, no Zoom, no internet, phone conversation. You were basically cut off once you got there. But I was immediately fascinated with what I found in the archives. And I was actually kind of happy not to be in France, which were in some ways overrun with Americans in the archives. You know, it was a bit lonely for a while, but I felt like I was doing something more unusual than being in some kind of comfortable expat community. Since then, Italy's become, in a way, a second home. As I said, almost for 50 years. I, of course, keep up with the scholarship. I read the newspapers daily, and some of my oldest friends now are in Italy. So working in the two countries has really been incredibly enriching.
Grazie. Essendo una studiosa statunitense impegnata sulla storia italiana, avrà avuto modo di confrontare metodologie, problematiche e tendenze storiografiche tra Italia e Stati Uniti. All'inizio del suo percorso di ricerca aveva osservato delle differenze tra queste due storiografie? E se sì, come si sono evolute? E oggi esistono ancora?
As I said, my research began in the 1970s. And when I left for Italy, it seemed natural. Indiana University had very strong fields in Russian and Eastern European history and Latin American. So most of my friends were also going off to do research, and it seemed to be a kind of normal activity, a normal choice to be going to a foreign country. Now, to answer your question more directly, I did, of course, I was struck when I got to Italy that there were, in some ways, quite different historiographical traditions. I had just come out, or I was in graduate school, trained in social history, well, all kinds of history, European history in general. But I was interested in social history, this idea using quantification especially to try to figure out the realities of everyday life of people who did not write, who hadn't left much that was written. And in the most extreme sense, to get around archival documents. I had a professor who said, don't go to the archives, it will color what you find. And that I didn't do, but I had taken quantitative methods, and I was hoping to somehow do a huge quantitative study of prostitutes based on government files. And I was also not well trained in women's history. It was still very new, but I'd done whatever I could, and I'd done a special field in women's US history. And so I had some ideas about how to, or hypotheses about how to approach approach my topic when I got to Italy. But when I walked into the Archivio Centrale dello Stato and told the archivist I wanted to work on prostitution after unification, she said, and it was a woman, prostitution does not have a history, and anyway, we don't have any documentation about that. So I was luckily young and energetic, and I went back several days. And finally, she said, well, you might try to look in the catalogs of the Pubblica Sicurezza and the Sanità Pubblica. And of course, Italy's bureaucracy was organized very much like the French. So once I got started, that wasn't too hard. And I found enough material for to be there 9 months. I was completely occupied. So it became clear to me that at least in contemporary history, neither this kind of new social history, I'm not talking about economic history or labor history or socialist history, but this new social history from below was not very common, and women's history was pretty much unknown. I mean, in the card catalog, there were the first books by Franca Pieroni Bortolotti, but otherwise, I couldn't find any secondary sources on women's history. Sometimes I felt maybe I was a little crazy, and at one point even went to Paris to talk to Louise Tilly about my topic. She did her dissertation on Italy and kind of get some reinforcement that what I was doing made some sense. But on the other hand, I was immediately, as I said before, entranced with the archives. It was, the paid papers were fairly unorganized, but it was clear no one had ever looked at them, and that was very exciting. You know, there were pamphlets with the pages uncut and little books and reports inside the documents. So I was happy and I was fascinated at trying to put together some understanding of a topic about which no one had ever written. Now, I also learned in Italy about Italian historiography and approaches that I needed to know more about. For one thing, the large field of political history, because I hadn't specialized in Italy, I needed to learn about all the parties, the unification, I mean, I knew about it in general, but much more specifically, as I was reading parliamentary debates, for instance, about kind of old-fashioned, but still very important party history, economic history. I found, you know, there was great economic historians, which I needed to read to understand industrialization and the kind of position of prostitutes, and even religious history, which has never been my forte, but I, you know, needed to know a little more about the role of the church in Italy. So I found these huge divergences. What I was particularly interested in, I didn't find immediately any companions in Italy or much secondary reading, but I was also learning a lot from the strengths in Italian historiography. Now, over the decades, I do think that there's been a great narrowing of the differences, which has been in some ways useful and in some ways, you know, kind of less interesting. By the 1980s, women's history was born in Italy. It was very exciting when I went back to do further research to know the pioneers of women's history, be involved in the group around Memoria, and to see how the kinds of themes that they focused on were both similar and different from what American women's historians were doing. I had to start learning much more about the medieval early modern period because I would say the earliest both social and women's historians in Italy were concentrated there. The whole group around Quaderni Storici in Bologna was doing the kind of social history, and then Memoria women's history, which wasn't very common in the contemporary period, also in the United States among Italian historians. Most historians were still focused on political history, diplomatic history, economic history, labor history. So to read women's history, I started reading about the earlier periods and began, through Italians, became acquainted with the use of anthropological methods. A lot, unlike American women's history, which to a certain extent started with suffrage, the vote, actually politics in the late 19th century, the early women's organizations. In the 1980s, Italian women's historians were more interested in families, sexuality, relationships, exchanges, class relationships, I would say to a certain extent more private life. And that was useful to me because they were very actively using anthropological methods to try to go beyond simply saying women were oppressed or they weren't oppressed, but they were very complicated relationships, both between men and women and among women, different elites and poor women, for instance. So that was a very exciting time, and I would say gradually over the years there was a partial coming together of the two fields. However, in the 1990s, in the United States, the cultural turn, the so-called cultural turn to cultural history, again, I think moved the US away in a sense. It became the driving force in historiography. Social history, the kind of history I did, was suddenly out of date already. And quantitative methods were, verboten. A table in a book was considered not really reliable. And historians turned to all kinds of, as you know, all kinds of mostly published and printed documents, which included literature and images, art, newspapers, that kind of thing. And this was certainly useful. It had sometimes been, I think, ignored or even denigrated by Marxist historians as just superstructure and having nothing to do with everyday life. But to me, the whole thing became it became a bit extreme at a certain point. And to me, pulled, I can't say about Europe in general, but pulled American historiography a bit away from this convergence with Italy. From my point of view, which may be, an exaggeration, Italian historians had always combined the two. There wasn't a huge battle between, are you a qualitative or quantitative historian? The same article would have theoretical context. It would talk about debates in printed literature, and then it would have tables based on archival evidence, depended on the evidence, which seemed to me really the practical thing to do. So at that point, and maybe it helped me feel comfortable in continuing to a certain extent what I had done. Now, certainly when I started working on Lombroso, I was working more in cultural history, history on published documents. But I still went to the archives, looked for other kind of information, and always tried to have some kind of put whatever I found in a much larger social economic text. I think economics has been left behind too much and needs to re-enter the picture. Now in the last, I'd say 10 or 15 years, I again see a convergence. There's such liveliness among younger historians in the United States and Italy. And I see certain topics, imperialism, colonialism, fascism, race, the Holocaust, environment, sexuality, as really becoming international projects. Sadly, I feel like the late 19th century is not particularly of such interest because many of these new works focus on the 20th century and even post-war Italy, which was considered political science when I went to graduate school. But I think there's wonderful interactions. Some of it, I think, due to the fact that unfortunately Italian there are no jobs anywhere, but it's much worse in Italy, and young Italian scholars have come to the United States on scholarships or to look for jobs or on postdocs. And so there's been much more interaction. I mean, it's wonderful in New York because we get so many Italian historians and scholars visiting. There have been a lot more participation, I think, by Italians in international conferences. Not that this didn't exist before, but sometimes in the past, on specialized conferences in crime or police, I was the only one giving a paper on Italy, and that seemed to be wrong. It seemed to me that there should have been an Italian historian there too. And this is completely different now. Part of its language, through the Erasmus School, and simply by determination, younger Italian scholars unfortunately have to speak English to participate in a lot of international events, and they do, and often very well. And then one of the only positive things about COVID, I think, is that because we've had to use Zoom, the internet exchange has grown immensely. I mean, I couldn't keep up. It was so nice to be able to at least passively, usually, sometimes actively participate with Italian colleagues during COVID and see people, learn what's going on. And the same thing happened the other way. And I know in the United States, certain organizations, such as the Columbia Seminar on Modern Italy, we are now discussing how to change the timing of our meetings permanently so that we can have Italian scholars attend the meetings. And I think that's a very, very good thing, and has really brought the two communities together. So this was from my specific vantage points of history of crime and history of women. These are my impressions of the kind of separations, but then coming together of the two traditions. But that has, again, besides finding archival documents, been of a fascination to me, to look at and to learn from the different ways in which the two historiographies function. And I think one reason I'm so happy in Italian history and maybe have to a certain extent been accepted by Italian historians is that my impression is still there is a huge devotion to the archives and archival research in Italy. And that's certainly not died out in the United States, but the cultural turn has taken some emphasis off actually going and working day after day on those kind of documents, and that's an incredible strength of Italian historiography.
Ok, grazie. Un'altra domanda. Nel dibattito pubblico italiano degli ultimi anni, il ruolo delle storiche e degli storici ha assunto sempre minore importanza, tanto che è presente all'interno della nostra comunità un generale pessimismo sul ruolo dello storico, a fronte invece di una ricerca storiografica che appare vivace e meno provinciale che in passato. Qual è la situazione negli Stati Uniti sotto questo aspetto, quello appunto della presenza degli storici nel dibattito pubblico, e che cosa la vostra esperienza può insegnare alle colleghe e ai colleghi italiani?
I'm not sure I have anything very hopeful to say to respond to your question. In the United States, professors have never been particularly recognized as public intellectuals, called upon for their opinions, and to the contrary, I think a bit denigrated for doing research on ridiculously specific topics, not making very high salaries, and not being practical, not even working, because of course they see us at home. This is a big exaggeration, but I'm from the Midwest, not New York City, and this is my firm impression. And certainly, unless you go on public television, which in the past, which in the United States used to be the only state-supported, government-supported channels, although now they have to pretty much support themselves. It was hard to find a professor ever asked to be on a show, much less a history professor, to give an opinion, or to, except for a very few famous and often non-academic historians. So I'm not sure I have anything positive, any advice. And even in academia, in the humanities in general and history in particular are declining. There are fewer students, there are fewer academic posts. University administrators are transferring money and faculty lines to departments of business and science and math and social science. I taught before I retired at John Jay College, which is a college which emphasizes criminal justice. All students took the liberal arts, took humanities, but all the attention went to sociologists and psychologists and practitioners of criminal justice. And there's an increasing shift toward that. Now, I can't even say this is a bright spot, but effect of the election of Donald Trump was, who of course is the epitome of anti-intellectualism, which I think is typical of the United States, is it encouraged, the media was so desperate, it's actually turned to historians. And you see many more historians now on television channels and radio interviews, because there's, a desperation about trying to understand our political crises. The first group that became prominent were what are called presidential historians in the United States, American historians who study presidents. Michael Beschloff is one of the more prominent ones, who were asked to put Trump in context. Every time he performed another outrage, historically, has this ever happened before? Can we confidently say he's completely out of bounds of American legal traditions? And then gradually, with the conversion of the Republican Party to fascism used loosely, I know as historians it's not technically fascist, but authoritarianism, white nationalism, racism, sexism, television shows have started turning to historians of fascism and Nazism to help them understand, help the public understand the signs of the collapse of democracy. And so there have been excellent European historians. Timothy Snyder, for instance, who's written so much about Eastern Europe, Nazism, Stalinism. Ruth Ben-Ghiad, who's an Italian historian who's become a kind of public intellectual, starting with Mussolini, but has written a book on dictators in general. So in this very narrow sense, journalists have started talking about historical context. And even if you read opinion pieces now in the New York Times, often they give historical context. But this is fairly new. And I think it's encouraging, but in terms of our political situation, which I hate to dwell on, but is an enormous cloud over here. I hope it's not too late.
Grazie. Ecco, negli Stati Uniti esiste ancora un interesse per la storia d'Italia, ora che la comunità italo-americana è ormai profondamente integrata nella società statunitense. Insomma, cosa interessava ai suoi studenti della storia italiana? Cosa interessa?
You mentioned Italian Americans, which of course is a huge group in the United States, and especially, although not solely, on the East Coast. My impression, and I'm not in any way authority on Italian American society or even history, but my impression is that most Italian Americans, like most other ethnic groups, don't know a lot about the country of their past. Italian history is rarely taught in elementary or high school. Even at the graduate level, my degree and most degrees are in European history, and that means Great Britain, France, and Germany. And like most immigrants, Italian Americans wanted to become Americans, and by the third generation, generally don't speak Italian or read Italian. I would say they, like most like most Americans, are fascinated with Italian fashion, traveling to Italy, food. There's still a huge Italian American tradition of food. But I find not a lot of real knowledge, at least about contemporary Italy. When I say I'm an Italian historian, most people assume I'm a Renaissance historian, and are a little taken aback by the idea that, Italy isn't just a museum, it actually has a contemporary history. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are doctoral students, and they're still training in Italian history. And those in Italian history are sometimes Italian American and sometimes not. And they are, completely immersed in Italian historiography. They come to Italy to do their research and are dedicated to every nuance of Italian history, but they're a fairly small group. Some of them are interested in the backgrounds of their families or the area they came from. I have a student, for instance, who wrote a dissertation and just wrote a book on 19th, early 20th century women in Basilicata, the ones who were left behind when men emigrated. And it turns out Basilicata, there's very little written on it. And this turned out to be a fascinating project. Another student whose family was from Sicily, very recently, so she still speaks and understands Sicilian. She did a dissertation on Fuitina, the kind of kidnapping of young girls for marriage, although it turns out sometimes it's elopement. But at any rate, she could do interviews in Sicilian. So there is some of the motivation among doctoral students or among Italian Americans to become doctoral students in Italian history. Now at lower levels, there's, sporadic among undergraduates, master's students. There is sporadic interest in the Risorgimento, unification, which is usually compared to Germany, fascism, of course, and Nazism. Sometimes the mafia. I teach taught courses on history of crime in Europe and legal history. But I'm kind of myself unhappy that I don't think in general there's a huge exposure to Italian history.
Bene. L'abbiamo già detto prima, il problema della ricezione della storia italiana negli Stati Uniti, ma i libri delle storiche e degli storici italiani vengono tradotti frequentemente e per contro è soddisfatta del modo in cui sono stati tradotti i suoi libri in italiano?
From my point of view, there's far too little translation of Italian historians into English. And this is certainly one reason that even sometimes my colleagues in European history who specialize in France and Germany don't know nearly as much about Italian history as they might. And of course, as I said, therefore, the exception are doctoral students or my colleagues in Italian history who read Italian. And the few times I've been able to have any possible influence, for instance, editing special issues of journals on Italian topics, I usually ask only or almost only Italian historians to write, not only because they're sometimes the best specialists, but it's a way for them to get some of their incredible archival research to get better known to an English language audience, which of course these days means a worldwide audience. I mean, it's in some ways unfortunate that you have to publish in English, but at least then it gets to Asia and Latin America and not just as it used to, the United States, Canada, England. Now, again, this is changing to a certain extent because of the younger scholars that I've been talking about. They come to the US and the UK much more often. They have more contacts. They understand how to get published in journals, like the Journal of Modern Italian Studies or Modern Italy. or even get their books considered by different presses that have series in Italian histories. Of course, you then have to pay for the translation, but this means that much more research is coming out. If you look at the journal Modern Italian Studies, for instance, often half the articles or more would be by Italians. So again, it's like international seminars. It's becoming much more a place of collaboration. So I think that this kind of wall is breaking down, but it was always very frustrating to me, especially when I was teaching, to have a very limited number of books by Italian historians that I could use, because except at the doctoral level, they had to be in English. So the situation's changing. I think it will more, but unfortunately, it's a one-way street that Italian research needs to be translated into English. There's more of an interest in England. If anyone wants a tip, it's easier to go to an English publisher, I think, usually than an American, because again, European history in the US, no one thinks immediately of Italy in the contemporary period. But since there's so much contact now, the scholarly groups are completely integrated. There are more possibilities. As for my own experience, I'm really extremely honored by having had my monographs translated into Italian. To me, in some ways, I can't say it's more important, I guess, because more people in the world read English. But I know, or I assume, there's a larger audience among students and the general educated public in Italy who read and learn something from the research I do, because it's available in Italian. All of my research is focused on social issues which are of some interest to me, politically, as a feminist scholar, and I therefore hope, I know in some cases it's happened, that my work gives some kind of context for Italians to think about those issues in the present, or Italian policymakers. And finally, after all that archival work, it's nice to know someone can understand the footnotes, that the references to the buste or the fascicoli, someone else can use, or even the printed sources in Italian, that they will be, sometimes guide other scholars to different areas, because I know most of them, that part of the footnotes, the references, are just of no use outside of Italian speakers, and I want them to be useful, because as with prostitution, to a certain, though lesser extent, but a certain extent with Lombroso, and again with prisons, I've tried to, or I've been interested in looking at areas that are understudied, where there's not much known, and there's a lot more to be done. And this gives a kind of start for other historians to look at other local archives, and or take certain aspects and expand on them.
Nei suoi lavori principali, nelle monografie La storia della prostituzione, il libro su Cesare Lombroso e i suoi allievi, e ora l'ultimo sul carcere, sono sempre presenti due temi di fondo: Cesare Lombroso, appunto, e la questione delle donne, la storia delle donne, la questione femminile, soprattutto sotto l'aspetto della storia sociale e della storia istituzionale. Lei pensa che l'intreccio tra una forte presenza della criminologia positivista in Italia e la questione femminile abbia prodotto un intreccio del tutto particolare in Italia sotto questo aspetto, oppure il caso italiano è comparabile con quello degli altri paesi occidentali?
You've certainly correctly identified my two main fields of research or passions. One women's history and the other Lombroso, though I might say a little more broadly, history of crime, or what we call criminal justice history, which in the 1970s and early 80s also took off as a new field of research, a kind of interesting, fun field of young people, both in the United States and internationally. For instance, in the Social Science History Association, we had a network of criminal justice historians, and now the European Social Science History Association has the same thing. In the very beginning, when I chose my dissertation topic, I thought of myself as a women's historian. That's what I was interested in. It was new, it was exciting, and there was very, very little known. And I chose the topic of prostitution in order to learn about, try to figure out something, understand in some way the life of poor women, and especially poor women who had been labeled, which was our fashionable term then, labeled as a deviant. I really didn't realize that I was going to have to read law codes, study how the police was organized, and read criminology. I didn't in any way think about what I was doing as a legal topic or a topic in criminal justice. But of course, I had to, studying prostitutes, come in contact with Lombroso, and I was fascinated by his theories. And as my book on prostitution was being published, I was already doing research on Lombroso, who was not unknown in the United States. As you know, and I think we've talked about this, in criminology, in textbooks of sociologists of crime, whenever they have a historical background, they mention Lombroso, and his name is fairly well known to people who study criminology, but in a very, very superficial way. And I was interested in him partly as a feminist. I mean, I was horrified at his theories, which, at least on the surface, were quite kind of frightening and horrid. His supposedly scientific analysis of women as inferior to men, and women as being determined by their sexuality and their sexual organs. But secondly, I was also interested in Lombroso as an example of a prominent theorist or intellectual who developed social theories. And I'm always trying to figure out, do these theories ever affect society, government policy, or wider understanding of social problems? I mean, here I was teaching in a college of really criminology, and what everyone was doing, you know, it doesn't make any difference. You know, does it affect either the what we call practitioners, such as the police, as they're going about their work, and does it, in the end, if we go down another level, affect the lives of those people being policed? That certain theories are dominant in a country at a certain time. So my original idea was simply to write a book on Lombardosian criminology and policing, police practice. And you might notice that chapter is fairly large in the book, because I was trying to see if I could trace the theory down through the government administration and possibly to the streets, the actual interaction between police and criminals. I ended up doing a much more expansive work, partially because the police records were closed. And I could do what I did in the book, which was discover Salvatore Ottolenghi and the Scuola di Polizia Scientifica, and certainly demonstrate that all the top administrators were trained in Lombardosian methods. Whether they all accepted them, I don't know, but they were trained. They had to take courses in criminal anthropology. And in that sense, I could see a clear link between criminology and actual administrative history. However, to then look at police records of cops on the streets, the militarized uniform force, that was not open. I was hoping through police reports to get a better sense if, for instance, Lombrosian words and concepts were used, and that was, I came to a kind of roadblock at that. I also started finding Lombardosian, at least language and concepts everywhere, in debates about women, in books about race, in the discussions about juvenile delinquency. And I started thinking, well, besides writing a book, first simply trying to lay out his core concepts, because most people in the United States, and I think even in Italy, where Lombroso had been pretty much brushed off as just kind of ridiculous, that people might not know what he actually said, but then also to begin to explore some examples of how and if his ideas actually penetrated into government practice, public discussions, journalism, writing, and that kind of thing. So it became broader. Now, in terms of, was Italy unique in the penetration of Lombardosian ideas about women? I mean, I think surely it was, in the sense that Italy was much more, his ideas were much more popular in Italy than many other European countries, better known. He was a well-known intellectual. He was seen and claimed to be modern, scientific, rational, secular. So certainly criminal anthropologists offered a forward-looking way to try to find an alternative to religious, more traditional religious or even philosophical concepts. He was leftist, I would say a kind of soft socialist, not a strict Marxist, but he was new, and people throughout Italy, and was friends with even people like Anna Kuleshov. I mean, he was a figure among those classes. He had students, many students, followers throughout the country, prison administrators, judges, doctors. So I think his presence was big, and it was even hard for feminists to ignore him and sometimes even completely refute him. And certainly major figures like Maria Montessori and some others were adopted some of his concepts. So he's a kind of huge presence there, and not as large, though certainly very well known in the rest of Europe or the United States. And in that sense, I'd say yes, there was probably a kind of weight to what he did, which made it harder for, let's say, Italian feminists to counter his ideas. On the other hand, transnationally, I think it's a difficult question, and there will have to be more research. I mean, as you've proven in your recent book, La Donna Delinquente got bad reviews in Europe. You know, in terms of its specific scientific claims, most criminologists, psychologists, psychiatrists around Europe, in Germany, France, England, were not convinced. And I think you argue correctly that Lombroso was trying to revive his reputation, but it was going down. So in that sense, certainly Lombrosianism, at least in specific aspects such as atavism, is that really the explanation for crime? Was waning, and certainly in Europe and the United States, alternative sociological theories were starting to gain momentum, to become more popular. Certainly by the 1910s in the United States, the Chicago School was to a certain extent dominant over biological explanations. However, it's always been my hypothesis that while the criminological debates became much more complex about men, and different schools of thought grew up which countered Lombroso either within the biological sphere or against biological explanations at all, that his views on women, in a general sense, that they're inferior and that their behavior, normal or abnormal, is mostly springs from, is controlled by their biology and their biological mission of motherhood, that was much less challenged. And this may be partially because there wasn't that much criminology. There weren't that many more books written until the 1970s about the criminology of women. I mean, Lombroso has to be given credit for the fact that he took it seriously and he wrote a whole book on it. You know, you don't find a lot of books focusing on women between about 1910 and 1970. But I think probably more importantly is because his ideas echoed, were pervaded with traditional notions that had started way before him, that men are to culture as women are to nature. This kind of traditional equations had already been developed and taken for granted both among religions, and I would say religions, all monotheistic religions, and by the 19th century secular bourgeoisie. So I think it was easier to echo these kind of ideas, which I found pervasive in at least books in English about prostitution that I read in the Kinsey Institute that were published in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They didn't mention Lombroso. I don't think technically they were reproducing his type of research, which was, of course, pretty outmoded. But the general outline of the kind of take it for granted assumptions about women's inferiority and their emotionality and their mental inferiority were all still there. So I think you've asked an excellent question, and I'm hoping there'll be a lot more research about it in both a general sense and a more specific sense.
Bene. Il carcere, la storia del carcere in Italia è l'oggetto del suo libro più recente, però giustamente lei osserva che il carcere è stato molto importante per gli italiani, è stata un'esperienza che molti italiani purtroppo hanno fatto nel passato, ma che è stato anche molto importante dal punto di vista della storia politica, dal carcere dei patrioti risorgimentali al carcere degli anarchici di fine Ottocento, al carcere degli antifascisti, al terrorismo tra gli anni 70 e 80 del Novecento. Eppure esisteva una vera e propria lacuna da parte della storiografia italiana su questo argomento, lacuna che il suo libro appunto colma per il periodo tra l'unità e la Prima Guerra Mondiale. Si è interrogata sulle ragioni di questa disattenzione da parte delle storiche e degli storici italiani?
Yes, I have, and it's puzzling to me why until recently there has been so little research on prison history in Italy. The first wave of books, certainly on Europe and the United States, followed directly after Foucault's Discipline and Punish, his famous book. And Foucault was well known in Italy. It's not as if no one was reading him. There was also in Italy already, and certainly has continued, a strong history of interest in other kinds of institutions, you might say institutions of confinement. In women's history, conservatories, there were a lot of brilliant books and articles back to the 1980s on conservatories, many of which helped me very much thinking through prisons, and especially women's prisons, and also manicomi, insane asylums. There's a fairly rich historiography there. So one can't say somehow that type of history didn't fit into Italian historiography. So I'm not sure I can give a good answer. I have a few hypotheses, certainly for the period that I've looked at, that I've focused on from unification to the First World War. The sources are difficult. A lot of them are missing. There are huge holes in the sources, and it's a bit frustrating. And I know it's not just me. Simona Trombetta wrote a wonderful book, mostly focusing before unification on women's prisons, and she found sufficient material, but I talked to her, she was incredibly frustrated. For the period I looked at in the Archivio Centrale, there's really nothing before 1890. So you have a big gap. In the Archivio di Stato di Roma, there's some material on specific prisons, but it concentrates before unification, and there's not too much afterwards, and it's relatively thin. I mean, I was hoping, again, whether I did a quantitative study or not, to find, all the buste, there was one for each prisoner, all the biographical clinical records for each prisoner. And I found a few here and there, but nothing like what could and should have been there. Now, probably their archives I hope there's some inspiration to prison history, because I hope that there are archives in other parts of Italy that are much more complete. And there won't be quite so many problems. Certainly in Rome, archivists told me they sometimes suspected there were still records in prisons, but they couldn't even get in to look. So I think there's also the problem of prisons being security institutions, closed institutions to outsiders, and whether they didn't transfer the documents or they still have them is a kind of question, and they're not easily accessed. However, there are a lot of, many other sources that I use: parliamentary debates, debates in journals and pamphlets, statistics, which I only began to probe. I mean, the prison administration, the Italian administration in general, from unification, kept incredible amounts of statistics. They were very sophisticated about it. And these are a good source. And if you're studying more educated prisoners, there are, of course, many memoirs and letters and that kind of thing. Now, secondly, in terms of my own period, as I mentioned before, there seems to have been a declining interest in the liberal period and the period after the Risorgimento and before World War I. This may also partially explain lack of research, but what about fascism? I mean, except for a few really good studies of Confino, the islands of Confino, we don't really know fundamentally much about quote unquote normal prisons, not political prisoners, specifically political prisoners, but how much was there continuity or change between the liberal and fascist period for, let's say, a thief or a prostitute? What happened to them in prison? And was the bureaucracy staffed by fascist administrators or not? There is a little it's clear that Italians participated in international conferences. They weren't completely cut off, but did policies, were they in some way standard in terms of international measures or not? I don't know about this. And reformatories, youth reformatories, I know from just looking at general statistics, the numbers of children increased immensely. And what did this mean for a regime who focused on youth as the future? And were they, what did it mean in terms of the policies of human reclamation, and how fascist were the programs in these institutions? Many were now called schools. They had different designations, but they were the same thing. And I think it's part of the general, a huge movement. And again, I'm not an expert on the period, institutionalization during the fascist period. If you look at the numbers of people in insane asylums, not just criminal insane asylums, it also increased drastically in the 20s and 30s. And so the kind of, growth in disciplining disciplining people in general by institutionalizing them, I think is a huge topic. So again, I can't give you any clear answer about why the topic has been, to a certain extent, ignored. There have been good studies for pre-unification, but not much since. Now again, we're at a turning point. There are quite a few scholars who are now actively doing research on prisons, and their conferences and their special journal issues, and a lot of energy. And this, I think, is really exciting. For instance, Chiara Lucrezia Monticelli, Francesca Pasquale, Elena Bacchine, and in the US, Stephen Soper. They're looking at prisons and politics, the church, penal institutions in the South. And of course, penal institutions is bigger than prisons, which is something I tried to emphasize. You need to look at Confino, the manicomi criminali, the jails. That's a really big and hard topic, where most people were incarcerated, even for small periods. Agricultural colonies. There's a whole array of institutions to study. So there's an enormous change, and I'm hoping that my book at least provides a structure, which may hold up or not, but a suggestion of overlapping periods influenced first by the church in the 18th century, then by Beccaria and the Enlightenment, and thirdly Lombroso and criminal anthropology at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, as some kind of turning points in policies and practice in prisons. But it's a huge field in which I also hope scholars will look both at men and women, adults and children, because policies and certainly the lives of inmates were very different depending on their category. And also the local context and historical memory of sometimes these kind of fascinating buildings, even which had a real important place in each community, and often right inside the city. The old ones in the middle of the city, and so they were part of a kind of urban texture that's usually been ignored, but people in the past would have been quite conscious of.
Un'ultima domanda, a cosa sta lavorando adesso?
That's a hard question. I'm not sure yet. I have some small projects. I'd like to write an article on prison guards, who I think are a fascinating group, a kind of liminal group between well-educated middle-class administrators who had gone to college and usually had law degrees, and of course the prisoners themselves, who usually had the same social backgrounds as the guards. Both were fairly poor and illiterate and powerless, although the guards, of course, had a certain power. And I have some material on that. There was also a very important reformatory for boys, government reformatory at Tivoli, and I just didn't have the space to put that in. But for a while, Rome had no reformatory, and I have a certain amount of research on that. Beyond that, I'm planning the translation of a short book by I'm not even sure, by someone probably whose pseudonym is Rosa Califronia, about women's rights in the late 18th century. I translated part of it years ago for Karen Offen, a major women's historian who wanted to talk about her include her in one of her books. And so we might write an introduction about this. And I'd like to do something, maybe a special issue of a journal on the first wave of feminism, because it's the 20s. The 2020s are the centennial of the deaths of Anna Maria Mozzoni and Anna Kuleshov. And there's now a new flowering of research about that, not about them, but about that period. And so in a way, it brings me back to women's history. But in terms of a huge project, I'm not sure what that might be.
Bene, grazie davvero per tutto questo tempo che ci ha dedicato e con i migliori auguri per le sue ricerche. Le mando un caro saluto dall'Italia. Grazie.
Grazie a te.
A presto.